There's a silent war that most people are fighting, a war not outside but within. They smile in public, but collapse in private. They seem calm, chaos brews behind their eyes. What if I told you that this war is not necessary, though, and there's a way to win it, permanently? To truly understand this transformation, one must begin by examining the nature of reaction itself. A reaction is immediate. It is swift, often emotional, and almost always unconscious. It is what happens when the inner world is hijacked by unresolved experiences, wounds, and archetypes operating beneath the surface of awareness. It is not the self who speaks or acts in those moments. It is the shadow. The shadow, comprised of all that has been repressed, denied, or deemed unacceptable by the conscious ego, springs forth when triggered, seeking expression through intensity, urgency, and impulse. In contrast, a response is slow. It emerges not from the fragmented pieces of the psyche, but from its integrated core. A response suggests the presence of reflection, space, and awareness. It means the individual has cultivated the capacity to pause between stimulus and action. And within that pause lies a profound truth that the shadow is no longer in control. Consider, for instance, a moment of interpersonal conflict. A careless comment is made, perhaps even intended to wound. In the past, this would have ignited a flood of emotion, rage, indignation, defensiveness. The body would tense, the voice would rise, and words would pour forth before thought could intervene. And yet, none of this would have been authentic. It would have been a defense mechanism, a shadow reaction rooted in ancient wounds of inadequacy or betrayal. The mind would justify the outburst later, but in truth, the shadow had taken the stage. When the shadow no longer governs energy, that same conflict unfolds differently. The comment is heard, the emotion still arises. This much is unchanged. But now, instead of being consumed by it, the observer within awakens. There is a moment of stillness. The body feels the emotion without acting upon it. The mind registers the trigger without becoming its servant. This is not suppression. It is conscious containment, the ability to hold energy rather than be possessed by it. And then, when the moment is right, a response comes. It is measured, rooted in clarity, and often, it reveals not only strength but a kind of sacred detachment. One has become the master of their inner world, not the puppet of its unacknowledged shadows. This evolution does not happen overnight. It begins with suffering. Emotional pain, repeated patterns, and cycles of regret eventually become unbearable. The psyche reaches a threshold where the old ways of reacting no longer serve. It senses that something deeper must be addressed. From here begins the journey inward. One starts to notice patterns, the repeated outbursts, the triggers, the emotional turbulence that seems to come from nowhere. Slowly, the realization dawns that these are not isolated moments. They are symptoms of something hidden within. As one explores further, it becomes evident that many of these reactions stem not from the present but from the past. A childhood wound, a forgotten humiliation, a moment of abandonment or betrayal. These experiences, once buried, form the roots of the shadow. They live on beneath the surface, unseen yet powerful, shaping how we interpret the world and respond to it. The moment this is recognized, a shift occurs. Awareness begins to separate the self from the reaction. The inner witness awakens. From this point onward, growth accelerates. Meditation, journaling, solitude, and deep introspection become tools, not escapes. Emotional triggers are no longer avoided, but welcomed as opportunities to meet the unconscious. Every time one chooses to pause instead of react, the shadow loses its grip. Every time one breathes through the urge to explode, flee, or blame, the psyche rewires itself. Emotional maturity is born not from never feeling anger, fear, or sadness, but from no longer being ruled by them. The physical body, too, reflects this shift. Where once there was tension, tight jaws, clenched fists, shallow breathing, there is now relaxation. The nervous system recalibrates. The fight or flight instinct, which once hijacked the body in moments of shadow eruption, gives way to a more stable and grounded presence. This does not mean one becomes passive or detached from life. Rather, it means that energy is no longer wasted on unnecessary emotional warfare. What once erupted outward is now channeled inward into deeper strength, awareness, and self-possession. In relationships, this transformation becomes especially visible. Misunderstandings, disagreements, and emotional complexities still arise, but they are met with greater compassion and discernment. The need to dominate, win, or protect one's fragile ego diminishes. Instead, communication becomes a tool for connection, not control. One listens more, reacts less. One speaks not to defend the self, but to express truth with clarity. This change is not always easy for others to understand. Those accustomed to the old reactive version of you may even provoke further in search of the chaos they once knew. The person who has integrated their shadow cannot be baited so easily. They have outgrown the games. This shift also has a profound spiritual dimension. To move from reaction to response is to step out of mechanical existence and into conscious life. It is the essence of individuation, the process by which the fragmented parts of the psyche are reconciled and the true self emerges. The one who responds instead of reacting has begun to live from this deeper self. They are no longer at the mercy of unconscious drives or ancient wounds. They have stepped into alignment with something wiser, something centered, something whole. In the earliest stages of inner awakening, the world appears to be filled with personal enemies. Every person becomes a symbol, an irritant, a rival, a threat, or a disappointment. Yet what the unconscious mind does not realize is that much of what it perceives as being there is in fact a reflection of what is buried deep within. This is the phenomenon of projection, and it is one of the most potent mechanisms through which the shadow exerts its influence. Projection is not a conscious act. It is not chosen. It happens automatically, invisibly, and constantly. It is the mind's way of offloading psychic content that feels too threatening to accept as part of the self. When a person carries hidden anger, they are quick to label others as aggressive. When someone denies their own need for validation, they often accuse others of being attention-seeking. The less we know about ourselves, the more convinced we become that our perceptions of others are accurate and objective. In truth, we are seeing fragments of our own dissound psyche in everyone around us. To recognize your projections is to step into a state of psychological maturity that very few ever reach. It requires the brutal humility to consider that your judgments may have less to do with the world and more to do with the unresolved within. It is not that others do not have flaws. They certainly do. But the intensity with which those flaws affect you, the disproportionate emotional charge, often reveals that a deeper internal dynamic is at play. The outer person has become a screen upon which the inner world is being unconsciously projected. This realization tends to strike during a moment of unexpected insight. Perhaps it happens in the midst of a heated argument. You accuse someone of being selfish, and in the silence that follows, a subtle voice arises within. Is this truly about them, or about the part of you that was never allowed to take up space? The question lingers. It stings, but it plants a seed of awareness. The mind begins to trace the roots of irritation, not outward but inward. And what it finds is surprising. Memories, emotions, fears, and longings that have been pushed into darkness. As this awareness grows, the ego becomes less reactive and more reflective. Instead of immediately casting blame, one begins to investigate. Why does this person's confidence unsettle me? Why do I feel so threatened by their freedom? These questions are not meant to shame, but to reveal. They are keys that open the door to the unconscious. They show us where the shadow lies. In relationships, this shift can be life-changing. Where once there was constant blame and projection, now there is inquiry. The dynamics become clearer. One realizes that the partner, the friend, the parent, these people are not causing the wound. They are revealing it. They are mirrors, not enemies, and in that realization, a powerful transformation takes place. The need to change others diminishes. The work becomes internal. The conversation shifts from, "Why are they like this?" to, "What part of me is being reflected here?" This does not mean one tolerates abuse or dysfunction. On the contrary, recognizing projection allows for clearer boundaries. It helps discern between genuine harm and shadow-driven perception. The mature mind can say, "This behavior is unacceptable," without needing to demonize the other. There is strength without hatred, clarity without arrogance, and this is because the projection has been withdrawn. The other is seen as they are, not as a canvas for inner wounds. The more one commits to this inner investigation, the more the emotional landscape begins to settle. The drama, the overreactions, the endless cycles of conflict, they begin to dissolve. The energy once used to defend, attack, or accuse is redirected inward. It becomes fuel for self-awareness, for healing, for growth. Each trigger becomes a teacher. Each judgment becomes a doorway. And slowly, the relationship with the self becomes more honest, more whole. Even the so-called positive projections, idolization, infatuation, blind admiration, come under scrutiny. One begins to see how we project our unlived potential onto others as well. The person who seems magnetic and powerful is often reflecting the part of us that has been silenced or suppressed. To recognize this is to reclaim that potential. It is to say, what I see in them, I also carry within me. This is how integration begins, not by chasing the qualities we admire in others, but by awakening them within ourselves. In time, life becomes less about managing external chaos and more about navigating the internal terrain. The world remains the same, but perception changes. Reactions soften, judgment fades, clarity emerges. There is no longer a need to fight every battle or defend every opinion because the source of tension is no longer outside. The individual becomes less entangled in projections because they are more rooted in self-awareness. They see the shadow when it tries to speak through others, but they no longer fall for the illusion. They no longer chase or avoid reflections. They learn from them. There comes a moment on the inner journey when a person stops running, not from others, but from themselves. The flight is subtle. It often wears the mask of productivity, moral superiority, even spiritual bypassing. But beneath these disguises is a single emotion: fear. Not fear of failure or the unknown, but a primal fear of the self. Specifically, of the parts buried beneath the ego's carefully constructed identity. The hidden rage, the hunger for power, the unspoken envy, the impulses society has labeled unacceptable. This fear is the shadow's strongest weapon, and it keeps the soul divided. To transcend the grip of the shadow, one must stop fearing the darkness within and begin facing it directly. This does not begin with courage. It begins with exhaustion. The constant effort to uphold an idealized version of the self becomes too heavy to carry. The mask starts to crack under pressure. Life has a way of bringing this about, through betrayal, loss, humiliation, or even moments of silence where the emptiness creeps in. Eventually, one is forced to confront the question, who am I, beneath all this performance? What is discovered beneath the surface often shocks the ego. The self-image of being kind, disciplined, rational, or enlightened is confronted by contrary truths. There is resentment. There is selfishness. There are fantasies that conflict with moral codes. There are wounded memories never fully grieved. At first, the ego resists. It insists this cannot be me. It wants to exile the darkness again. But something deeper, perhaps wiser, intervenes. A voice from within whispers, this too is you. And until you accept it, it will control you. This is the beginning of integration. Not through analysis, not through detachment, but through radical acceptance. The person begins to sit with the darker emotions rather than avoid them. When anger arises, it is not immediately judged or suppressed. It is studied, felt, honored. What triggered it? Where does it live in the body? Whose voice does it echo? This kind of inquiry reveals that what was labeled darkness is often just wounded energy. It has not come to destroy, but to be acknowledged. The darkness also reveals parts of the psyche that are not evil, but simply repressed. For instance, a person who was raised to be overly accommodating may discover buried aggression. Not to harm others, but to assert boundaries. Another may find a manipulative impulse, not as a desire to deceive, but as a survival strategy shaped in childhood. These realizations do not justify the behavior, but they provide context. Understanding dissolves fear. The darkness loses its monstrous shape and becomes more human. A profound shift happens when one begins to dialogue with the shadow. Instead of trying to silence it, one asks, what are you trying to protect? What pain are you carrying? What truth are you afraid to speak? In this space, the shadow is no longer an enemy. It becomes a messenger. It reveals unmet needs, unhealed wounds, and unlived potential. Sometimes it speaks in anger, sometimes in grief, sometimes in silence, but it always has something essential to show. Facing one's darkness is not about indulgence. It is not about acting out or glorifying destructive traits. Rather, it is about becoming conscious of the inner forces that influence behavior from the background. What was once compulsive becomes a choice. What was once unconscious becomes visible. The result is not chaos, it is greater inner order. Paradoxically, the more one becomes familiar with their darkness, the less it erupts in destructive ways. In relationships, this self-intimacy creates a new level of authenticity. One no longer enters interactions from a place of pretense or moral superiority. They are aware of their shadows, and therefore, more tolerant of the shadows in others. They can hold space for complexity. They no longer need to project blame or wear masks. This vulnerability is not weakness. It is strength. It communicates, "I have met myself. I am not afraid to meet you." This inner meeting also transforms one's spiritual path. The light is no longer sought as an escape from darkness as a result of having embraced it. The person begins to understand that true wholeness includes both day and night, ascent and descent, the divine and the human. They stop striving for purity and start moving toward integration. The soul, once fragmented, begins to cohere. One of the most powerful signs that someone is no longer afraid of their own darkness is that they can hold silence. Not just external silence, inner stillness. In that space, the shadow may arise. It may whisper memories, regrets, desires that challenge the ego's image. But instead of recoiling, the person listens. They no longer flinch. They no longer hide. The fear has been replaced by a quiet reverence for truth, even when its energy is the currency of the soul. It fuels creativity, vitality, relationships, and the very essence of being. Yet, when the shadow dominates, this energy is siphoned off, fragmented, and wasted in unconscious battles that drain the spirit. The shadow feeds on conflict, on unresolved emotional debts, on reactivity that scatters attention and focus. It thrives in the chaos of disowned feelings and denied truths. To reclaim energy is to withdraw it from these unconscious arenas and bring it back into conscious possession. It is a profound act of sovereignty, one that marks a new stage in psychological wholeness. The first step in reclaiming energy involves recognizing how much has been lost. Many live their lives unaware of this depletion. They may feel chronically tired, overwhelmed by emotional storms, or caught in repetitive cycles of drama. These are not merely external pressures, but signs of internal dissonance. The soul is calling out, asking for reprieve. The unconscious, through the shadow, has been drawing energy away from the center, scattering it in defense mechanisms, projection, resistance, and denial. When the shadow controls energy, there is a sense of fragmentation. The person feels pulled in many directions, torn between desires, fears, and compulsions they do not understand. The psyche is divided. Each fragment demands attention and fights for expression. This inner battle leaves the self exhausted, disconnected from the core of vitality that once animated life. Creativity falters. Motivation wanes. Relationships become draining rather than nourishing. Reclaiming energy, therefore, is not about acquiring something new. It is about recovering what was always there, but hidden beneath layers of shadow. It is a process of inward return, a homecoming. As awareness grows, the individual learns to observe where their energy is being lost. Which thoughts, emotions, or behaviors are draining them? Which relationships or patterns perpetuate this loss? This observation requires honesty and courage, for it often uncovers uncomfortable truths. With this clarity comes the power to set limits, to say no to that which diminishes, and yes to what nourishes. This is a crucial shift from being reactive to being intentional. Instead of scattering energy on every emotional trigger or shadow drama, one begins to conserve and redirect it. Attention is focused on growth, healing, and authentic expression. The nervous system, once keyed into fight, flight, or freeze, begins to stabilize. The body and mind work in harmony rather than opposition. The process also involves reclaiming energy that was given away unconsciously to others. Projection not only places disowned parts onto others, but often transfers the psychic energy that belongs to the self. When a person constantly battles with someone else's perceived flaws or faults, they are, in fact, expending energy that could be held within. By recognizing projection and withdrawing it, energy is recovered and reinvested in the self. This reclamation is not selfishness, it is self-care and self-possession. Another important aspect of reclaiming energy is learning to embrace stillness and silence. In a culture that values business and distraction, quiet moments are often feared or avoided. Yet, stillness is the container in which energy regenerates. It is the sacred space where the psyche can reorganize and replenish. Through practices such as meditation, mindful breathing, or simply resting without distraction, One cultivates the capacity to connect with the source of inner vitality. This is not an escape but a return. The energy reclaimed through these efforts transforms how one moves through the world. It allows for presence that is steady rather than scattered. It supports decisions made from clarity rather than confusion. It nourishes creativity that flows freely rather than being blocked by inner turmoil. Relationships become sources of exchange and mutual nourishment rather than battlegrounds for unconscious forces. This return of energy also changes the experience of time. Rather than being caught in reactive loops that feel endless and exhausting, there is a sense of flow and rhythm. The person learns to invest energy in what matters most and to let go of what no longer serves. Priorities become clearer, and the noise of irrelevant distractions fades. This clarity is not external but felt deeply within, as a steady pulse of life force that carries one forward. At a deeper level, reclaiming energy is an act of reclaiming the self. It is the movement from being a divided, shadow-driven being to a whole, sovereign presence. The energy once trapped in shadow defenses is liberated and integrated. It is transformed from reactive force into creative power. The person no longer gives away their power through unconscious patterns, but stands firmly in their own center. This new relationship with energy is not static. It requires ongoing attention and care. The shadow will continue to surface, testing boundaries and attempting to reclaim its hold. But the difference is now the individual has tools. Awareness, reflection, boundaries. To recognize and redirect these forces, the energy flows where it is consciously invited and held. This reclamation is the foundation of true freedom. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom from inner slavery. It is the sovereign dance of light and shadow, where energy moves in service of the whole self rather than the fragmented parts. It is the embodiment of conscious presence, the reclaiming of life's most precious resource. The journey from being controlled by the shadow to reclaiming your own energy is not a simple path, but it is the most profound transformation one can undertake. It requires courage to face the parts of yourself that have long been hidden, humility to recognize the projections that distort your view of others, and the willingness to embrace your inner darkness without fear. Through this process, you break free from unconscious patterns that have drained your vitality and fragmented your spirit. You become whole, centered, and sovereign, no longer a victim of shadowy impulses, but a conscious creator of your own energy and life. This is the true liberation of the self, to live with clarity, authenticity, and the power that comes from embracing all aspects of who you are.